You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis. What does it mean to be a British citizen? Formally, it means obtaining a passport and the right to vote. But what else? Does it mean speaking English? Appreciating Stonehenge, maybe? Or knowing what to do if you accidentally spill someone's beer in the pub? According to the Home Office, it means passing a multiple-choice test after reading the handy guidebook, Life in the United Kingdom. Since 2005, passing the test has been a necessary requirement for any foreign national who hopes to stay in Britain indefinitely or who wants to become a British citizen. The government says successfully passing the test shows sufficient knowledge of life in the UK and the English language. But while there's been a high pass rate for immigrants from Australia, Canada and the US, less than half of those who applied from some Asian countries passed the £50 exam. Meanwhile, just 14% of native Brits passed a sample test, prompting accusations of double standards. This week, a new version of the test is being introduced after the current government decided the old one focused too much on life skills and not enough on British history and achievements. To discuss this, I'm joined by Peter Hill, an award-winning journalist and former editor of the Daily Express. Dr. June Bam-Hutchison is an author and academic at the University of York, whose work has focused largely on the construct of identity and the notion of citizenship. Dr. Prem Poddar is formerly a professor of English and is now a full-time academic and Humboldt Fellow. Joining us on the phone is Dr. Tom Brooks, a reader in law from Durham University. To get started, I'd like to ask Dr. Poddar, you took the test 5 years ago. Can you tell us some of the questions you were asked?
Well, the two questions I remember, I think one was about how do you respond to spillage of beer? And of course, there were some accompanying, multiple choice responses that one had to select from. So that was a memorable one.
What was the right answer?
I don't remember what the right answer was, actually.
I think it involves apologising and offering to buy them a beer.
Yes, something like that. And the other one I remember was a list of countries that became independent in 1947. That was pretty easy for me because I did come from one of those countries.
I don't come from one of those countries and I don't know the answer. But I'll ask you then, has knowing the answers to any of those questions or passing that test successfully helped you in any way since in the 5 years you've lived in Britain?
Not at all. Not at all. I think a lot of the questions were absurd, really absurd.
What do you think it means, or why did you choose to become a citizen? And anyone else can jump in here as well. What do you think it means to be a citizen rather than just a permanent resident in this country?
Well, I didn't become a citizen. I took the test to get my indefinite leave to remain in this country. Yeah.
Well, I became a British citizen, and I suppose that one of the reasons why I took the test originally was so I could have my permanent residency, so I could continue working as an academic in the UK, which I required as a non-EU citizen. But the other reason is being originally from the United States, of course, my country fought a war about taxation without representation, and since I was paying taxes to the UK, I wanted to be represented and be able to participate in political life and be able to in elections and so on. So there were some further reasons why I thought it was worthwhile to become a citizen as well.
Can you remember any sample questions you were asked, Dr. Brooks?
Oh my goodness, I could. Vividly. I took it only a couple of years ago. So one of the questions was, how many MPs are there in Parliament? And the answers they give you, it's multiple choice, as you noted. The correct answer for the test was 646, although what was actually true was 650. You had to put down 646 to get it right, and I did, and got it right.
So 650 wasn't one of the options in the test?
That's right. It wasn't one of the options on the test, and that was a real problem with the test. So another quick one was that I was asked on my actual test, what are the two places, they gave you four choices, what are the two places you can go to get your national insurance card? Well, the correct answer was the Social Security Office and the Job Center Plus. What was curious about this was, of course, the Social Security Office had closed years ago, and so you couldn't go there to get your national insurance card. What was a bit more laughable is that to take the test at all, you had to have your national insurance number anyway. So to kind of ask you was, in some sense, pointless because you already had to have it. In addition, the other choices you had for that question were things asking you about departments, like the Department of Education and Skills, I think was on that question, which had also ceased to exist. It had been merged into something else, into biz. So you had questions about departments and programs that no longer existed. You had questions about numbers that were no longer true. And so there's a lot of problems with the way the test had been done, but I don't think a lot of those problems have been solved in the handbook and the test published today.
I don't think it matters what the questions are, because neither the old test nor the new test tells you anything at all about the suitability of a person to be a citizen of Britain or anywhere, because the questions are just a kind of a token collection of random questions about ridiculous things like, when did the Wars of the Roses start, or stuff like that. What English county is Stonehenge in? Well, do they even know what a county is? It'd be more relevant to say what is an English county. But I did this test last night. I thought I'd better have a go, and I just managed to scrape through with 75%. And I have to say that several of those answers that I got right were lucky guesses. So I just think the whole thing is rather silly.
Does anyone actually think that a test of this sort is necessary? What about you, Dr. Bam-Hutchison?
I don't think it's very necessary. I did it in 2009. My life hasn't changed before 2009 or after 2009. It made no qualitative difference to my existence here in the UK. So from that perspective, it's an irrelevant measurement, and you can't measure somebody's identity and sense of belonging and, whether they're a responsible citizen through some random questions. So for me, it just looks like something which is constructed, of course, and we live in worlds where there are two existences, when the citizenship test for me is in that constructed world that runs parallel to reality. It's not our reality. And I think once you get your head around that, and you look at that as a citizenship test, and you really wonder, what is this actually about?
Yeah, why do we think the Labour government did introduce the test back in 2005? And why do we think the Tories what's their motivation in keeping it today? Peter Hill.
Well, I think that when it was Labour's turn in power, they just liked to employ more and more civil servants. And this was an excuse to employ a whole lot more, so they, the whole thing must cost an absolute fortune to run and administer. It's inaccurate, it's silly, and there isn't any point to it. And why on earth the Conservatives have continued it, I don't know. But I suspect the reason is that they think they have to be seen to be doing something about immigration and all that. But in fact, it doesn't address any of the issues that immigration raises at all.
Dr. Bam-Hutchison?
Yes, and adding to what Peter's saying is the fact that even that is a construct, because the UK and Britain has been shown to be no different to any other country in terms of people coming in and people leaving. In fact, there's an influx of people now from the north back into Africa for work, for sun, for better opportunities. So it's all part of a big myth. And it's probably a kind of construct that politicians need to keep alive, a kind of imagination that they need to keep alive, and not necessarily the reality and the truth for the people on the ground.
Is there any benefit at all in having new citizens become familiar with at least some parts of the culture or the history of the country they're adopting? Dr. Poddar?
I suppose the whole ideology of putting forward this test comes about, to go back to your earlier question, because of 9/11, because of the underground bombings, because of the backlash against multiculturalism. So it is a response to the assertion of multicultural rights, which in turn is a response to the assertions of Britishness and Englishness that we have seen, quite strident. But I suppose when we want to think about Britishness or Englishness, whatever that might mean, we need to, as June pointed out, we need to think about how the nation is constantly being remade. So what are the new ideas of Britishness that we can put forward? Is multiculturalism integral part of Britishness today in that sense? So this ever-changing idea of what it means to belong, the borders of belonging that are mutating all the time, the idea that one can subscribe to multiple citizenships, multi-layered belongings in a sense, that kind of dismantles this idea of citizenship that is being defined in a very unitary, very singular sort of way.
You're never going to sort all that out with a few random questions, are you? I mean, those are really complex matters, and it would take a very long interview before you could establish whether somebody embodied all those different thoughts. But one of the things that I think about all this test is that it's so hypocritical of the British to expect other people to know so much about their own culture when the British people who live abroad, mostly to my knowledge, can't speak the language. They never try to speak the language. They form expat groups. They don't get in touch with the culture of the country that they're in. They form quite isolated communities. They go to the golf club and moan about the weather at home and things like that. So it's complete nonsense that they should expect people who come to this country to know everything there is to know about England.
If it is so that you need to know the history and culture of the country when you come to the country, I think that is human nature to find out very quickly what's the local intelligence in terms of streetwise, existence. So you don't even need a test. You go to a place, you're going to find out it's part of human nature and you'll survive. Now, if that is the departure point, then one would have expected in Britain, where there's been a great progress on the level of understanding the major historical periods, and 1999, the Macpherson report and what this means for Britain and institutional racism and Stephen Lawrence and all of that. But yet such things would not necessarily form the backbone or core even of the curriculum in the UK. So that long, substantial history, where black history, for example, in this country is still very marginalized, and one would imagine, it should really be core history. One should imagine in becoming a citizen of such a place with such a complex history, and where there has been a movement to really foreground important aspects of history and diversity and inclusion, that becomes your citizenship test and not something of a long bygone era of the 19th century.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're discussing the British citizenship test.
I agree with much of what Peter says about the kind of hypocrisy that the test has, that my wife is English and finds that, most people I know who are English have a lot of trouble with a lot of the questions that are in the book, and this kind of the standard that new immigrants are expected to satisfy is much higher than, say, what we might, now that I'm British also, that we expect of our countrymen when we go abroad and so on. But I think that there's maybe something else going on. It's clearly an effort. It's been an effort of the previous Labour government. It's clearly part of the strategy now that this test is designed to show that, one is tough on immigration, taking it very seriously and making it very difficult to get through. However, who are the people that take the test? People who want to be permanent residents who can't be permanent residents otherwise. Who are these people? They're non-EU. A lot of the reaction, I think, to immigration and new migrants coming into Britain often aren't about non-EU people coming to the country who cannot claim any benefits of any kind anyway. When I came on my temporary work visa, and likewise it said on my permanent work visa when I had that also for 5 years, I was not able to claim any benefits from anybody for anything. If I couldn't support myself, I was out. My work visa was tied to the place I was working for. I had to be sponsored, and if they cut that off, I was out. It's a reaction to sorting out a problem with immigration against a population that has to, in some sense, fend for themselves. It's about the non-EU population, and we have to be able to provide for ourselves, have to be able to pay our taxes, and so on. And it's an odd barrier or an odd way of addressing the so-called problem, which I don't know what it is. That said, I'm actually maybe a slight dissent from the group. My problem with the test isn't so much that there is a test. I think a test can be okay. I just have a big problem with the kinds of questions that are on it. I think a test that measured or tested be able to practically live and survive in British society. I think something like that might be okay, which I think some earlier versions try to do, although try to do it badly. I think where it tries to stray into testing Britishness, whatever that means, I think that's when, and maybe that's where we have some broad agreement. Then I think that things do become a bit silly and ridiculous and more problematic.
I've got some much better questions in view of what you say, because I was thinking about this last night, and my questions, I think, are far more of a reflection on how British you might be. So my first question is, do you want mushy peas with your fish and chips? If not, then you're not suitable for a citizen. Number two, would you automatically join a queue if you saw one?
What is a queue?
Well, there you are. That's right. Well, we've abolished them, really. Are you able to moan about the weather for at least half an hour? Could you explain the LBW rule in cricket? That's a question especially for women. When someone says "How do you do?" do you expect an answer? Would you say sorry if someone stepped on your toe? Do you like dogs? And I don't mean to eat. And then my final one is, what do you do if someone says, "Oh, do drop in to see us if you're passing"? A, make a point of calling on them at the earliest opportunity. B, realise they don't mean a word of it. So those are my questions about how, whether you're British or not.
I was ruled out on not liking mushy peas. So.
Okay. Oh, you're finished then.
Yeah. But more seriously about the content of the test, I mean, the government at the moment says they've changed the current test or decided to strip out mundane information about water meters or how to find train timetables or using the internet and replace them instead with questions about 1066 and Jessica Ennis. For everyone else, then, what questions should be on the test if we must have one?
This statement by the Home Office is a bit ridiculous, that stripping out the kind of inessential facts. What did they strip out? They stripped out the things they should have kept in. How to register with a GP. What is the NHS? How to call an ambulance. How to report a crime. If you're arrested, what are your rights, if any? These are the kinds of questions they should be having on it. This is the kind of stuff that people ought to know. And these are the essential facts that the government actually took out of what the test already had. It's claimed that it's kind of inserted into the test history. Has it added questions about history onto the test? Yes, it has. But as it added content about history, no, it is not. The first and second edition of the citizenship test, which I have right next to me right now, both of them have chapters on history. The problem was that they didn't include questions about them on the test. I think they should have. So the differences between the new test and the old test, that the new ones got history and culture and the old ones don't, is a bit ridiculous. And the thought is that the inessential stuff has been ripped out and only the essential bits remain is ludicrous. In fact, I'll give you another example. What other questions should be on? Well, I don't know. What kinds of schools are there in Britain? There was a chapter about education in the old tests. This has been removed. There's a small section relating to how you can become more involved in your community. Under that, there's a little section about you could become involved in your schools, maybe as a governor of a local school, and also from the website you can go to sign up and set up your own free school. There's information about that. But no information about the different kinds of schools available, no information about what the curriculum is, what is a curriculum, what is on the curriculum, that there's different curriculums across the UK, no information about GCSEs, no information about A-levels, no information about universities, and guess what? No information about school uniforms, their cost, and also that to work and volunteer in these schools, because the book is very big on your volunteering, taking a positive role in your local community, absolutely nothing in here about the fact you'll need a CRB check to work with all these young people they want you to work with, which is a very strange omission from what was before. So lots of things to add, and I question deeply the things that they've removed.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia in London. I'm Vivienne Nunis, and today we're talking about the citizenship test, the multiple choice exam immigrants must pass if they want to be a citizen or to stay in Britain indefinitely. I'm joined by journalist Peter Hill, academic Dr. June Bam-Hutchison, research fellow and blogger Dr. Prem Poddar, and reader in law Dr. Tom Brooks. I want to ask about the requirement to speak English now. The Home Office says the citizenship test is partly to learn about life in the UK, but partly to prove English language proficiency. Is that fair? Peter Hill, you were saying English nationals overseas don't learn a foreign language often, and it's a hypocrisy to ask foreign nationals to learn English when they come here.
The reason that they don't learn the language is that everybody speaks English. And I'm quite sure that in a few hundred years nobody will speak anything else, because it is becoming more and more an international language of pretty much everything. The EU, I think, conducts most of its business now in English. So we've got lazy, and it's actually not helped us. It's not helped our schools, because the teaching of foreign languages in British schools, in my opinion, is the worst that it could possibly be.
What about the idea of speaking the language, though, to assist integration? Isn't it necessary that if people are going to integrate in Britain and there is going to be social cohesion, a basic working knowledge of the English language is some sort of requirement? Dr. Padar?
I'm glad that you raised the issue of integration, because I think one of the reasons for having this test is this idea that, immigrants don't integrate into British society. I think this priority of integration has to be examined. I mean, there can be different forms of integration. I think migrants to this country can exercise different modes of belonging, different modes of integration. One would be maybe just to assimilate. Two would be maybe just to maintain cultural differences, demand group rights. The third one might be to have a very cosmopolitan, very hybridized, hyphenated, mixed identity. So I think this needs to be recognized that, there are different ways of belonging. And I think the majoritarian culture in this country also needs to see that there can be the different forms of integration in that sense. I think the whole idea of integration needs to be unpacked here.
What does anyone else think? I mean, if the government was to replace the test with some other form of policy to encourage integration, what should they do instead, or should they do anything at all?
Yeah, I've got a problem with connecting citizenship with English tests and proficiencies and all those things, or a sense of living here. And then I think it's people will have to, wherever they find themselves, in whichever workplace, it's going to become part of that workplace, that you do understand the language, and through your training, and should be part just of professional development anywhere in the world, in England or wherever. It becomes a problem if it becomes an instrument and a test and something that you must go through, and especially if it's based on memory-based learning. I've got a big problem with that, coming from a society where memory-based learning was sort of forced on us, as part of oppression. So it means nothing. And I really, my position is this, that it's really not necessary as part of integrating in society. You will in any case integrate, and you will have to go and have certain proficiencies. The problem comes when it's connected legally to your status in society.
You can't force people to be integrated in society, and people have got to feel free to do what they like. It's ridiculous. It's sort of some sort of brave new world where people are forced to integrate into the community. I mean, I just think that's so un-English anyway. We don't force people to do things like that. I mean, obviously it would be good if people wanted to integrate into the community, but it isn't compulsory, and it should not ever be compulsory.
I didn't say that. Yes, I'm saying it's...
No, I'm not saying you did.
Yeah. It's just part of living that you will integrate if you want to.
More or less.
Yes, if you want to.
To go back to the language question and the history question that was raised, as Peter said, the world has been Englished, but I think the test and people in general should recognize that there's not only an Englishing of the world, but English itself has been worlded in many ways. So in the same way, to think about history as confined to these British Isles is absolutely absurd, in the sense that, English history happened overseas. We must recognize that. So instead of having a very narrow view of history and a knowledge that is required on the basis of that, why don't we have questions that relate to, say, Britain's involvement in slavery, in colonialism, what it did around the world, in a sense. So it just shows that, Britain is not alone in that sense. It is intimately tied to the world in a sense. So therefore, this idea of a singular citizenship is not really tenable in that sense.
Dr. Brooks?
That everyone, I think, a lot of people have commented on the test about the English requirement have overlooked. Putting the rights and wrongs of having to know English to one side, it has always been the case for the first and second versions of the test that passing the citizenship test was also supposed to show that you had a certain level of English proficiency. And the new edition, which I have in my hands, says that this is the case for this book too, except from October 2013, so October from this year, the requirements will change. And from that date, you'll have to both pass the Life in the UK test and produce acceptable evidence of speaking and listening skills. It seems that there's another qualification to get. So one of the kind of added problems about this, in addition to the rights and wrongs of questions about integration, the rights and wrongs about whether or not English proficiency should be required, the test that is designed and published, anyone who passes it, allegedly their English is at a satisfactory level. So then why is the government, which has increased the number of books that you must buy, so it's gone from 1 to 2, and this year there will be 3. Interestingly, the sample question book with some sample questions to help you prepare for today's test is still not published. We will not get it until later this week. Passing the test today means you've got satisfactory English, but passing the test in October, the same test from this October, will not be proof that you have satisfactory English. And it just seems to be, in addition to all the things that others have said, seems to be a bit of a kind of a blatant money grab exercise.
Yeah, it's £50 a pop, so...
£50 a pop, and now you have to pay an extra fee to get the extra thing for your English. The price of the textbook has gone up from $9.99 to $12.99. No one sends you these things free in the post. I'm sure, I haven't double-checked my price of my question book. I'm sure my new study guide is more expensive. And then there's this third book. They produced a brand new, entirely different third book about some advice about sitting this test more generally. I've got no idea what could possibly be in that book that's not already in the current textbook and what should be in the question and answer book. But it's yet another thing. If you're preparing for the test and you want to pass and it's 50 quid, you don't want to take it too many times. You can do it just once. That's what you want to do. God knows what's in it. And it hasn't been published yet.
You're listening to The Voice of Russia from the heart of London. On weekdays, we broadcast live from 4 p.m. until 8. We'll bring you news, current affairs, features and debate. You can listen to us on digital radio and online. Visit ruvr.co.uk.
Well, it feels like we could go on discussing this for a lot longer, but I'm afraid we have run out of time for today. On that note, I'd like to thank each of my guests for joining us here at the Voice of Russia in London. We heard from Peter Hill, journalist and former editor of the Daily Express, academic Dr. June Bam-Hutchison, Humboldt Research Fellow Dr. Prem Poddar, and Dr. Tom Brooks, a reader-in-law from Durham University. Thanks to each of you for your time today. Next up on Voice of Russia is the news.